world. It's KYIV Not Kiev, Ambassadorial Season 2.0. We are Tatiana Haiduk and Polina Ivanishin. It's 9 months of bloody war that Russia started in Ukraine. KYIV Not Kiev's community of Ukraine supporters has tripled over this time. Friends, we're grateful for your kind support, donations, and incredible courage to join the International Legion. Ukraine remembers.
We want to show that Ukraine is living through, despite everything going on. We want to show that Ukraine is fighting and that Ukraine is winning. The fight is going not only in the battlefield, but also in the informational field to combat Russian propaganda and to debunk myths around Ukraine. We are involving our allies, who are the foreign ambassadors of our ally countries, who are experiencing everything that we are going through here in Kyiv together with us.
Today we have a big pleasure to talk to His Excellency Mr. Ambassador of Sweden to Ukraine, Tobias Thyberg. Mr. Ambassador, so nice to see you again.
Nice to see you both again as well.
Last year, approximately a year ago, we were here together with you, speaking about your life in relatively safe Kyiv during the war which started in 2014.
Am I afraid of being hit by a grenade when I walk out on the street? No, the answer is definitely not.
Obviously, everything has changed. So, how are you today? How is your life in Kyiv today after everything which happened?
Life is very different. Of course, it's not the way it was before the war. It couldn't be. I feel very privileged, frankly, to live in Kyiv and be allowed to do the job that I do at this time, because right now the future of Europe is being decided in Ukraine. And so for somebody who works with foreign policy issues like I do, there could be no better place to be. It's of course a very difficult time for Ukraine, but at the same time I think this is a time when everybody feels, who is in Ukraine, feels that we are where history is being made. And I think that is also something which, despite all the difficulties, is professionally very rewarding. So that's how I feel.
Russia is now trying to win people's attention, creating dozens of narratives that picture Ukraine as a Nazi, satanic, failed state. Don't know what's the worst out of the list. What is the most silly thing you've heard about Ukraine?
The silliest thing? There's been so many silly things. So I mean, the silliest thing was maybe the killer mosquitoes. Was that what they were saying?
Yes.
Was that what Russia was saying in the
they dared
security?
to talk about that on the United Nations. Yeah.
Right. So apparently, according to the Russian permanent representative of the United Nations, I don't know if it was Ukraine or maybe it was NATO which was preparing an army of killer mosquitoes. So yeah, so that was pretty funny. I think the accusations of Satanism are also pretty funny. But to be more serious, in a way, in terms of disinformation, I think the sort of consistent Russian narrative that there is a problem with right-wing extremism in Ukraine, in a way, is the most dangerous of the Russian false narratives and the Russian lies. And the reason why I think it is the most serious is because it's probably the only one which somebody who wasn't particularly well informed about the situation in Ukraine might realistically buy into. I mean, it's enough to look at the Ukrainian parliament to understand that this is a completely empty narrative. Ukraine is a European democracy which has had a number of parliamentary elections since its independence in 1991, and Ukraine has never once in its history as an independent nation had a right-wing extremist party in its parliament that has had any strength or any ability to exert influence over national politics.
How is this narrative perceived in Sweden by the Swedish people?
I think in Sweden, Sweden is so close to Ukraine and that it doesn't have any impact on the Swedish debate. Mm-hmm. That is my impression, at least.
For this interview, we have chosen several narratives to speak about them and to debunk these myths, and we want just to focus on some of them. Let me start with the first one. The first one is that Ukraine is an invention of Vladimir Lenin. So. What do you think about it?
This is going to be a funny conversation today, yeah?
Yeah, it's so difficult to put this mask of being serious while talking about mosquitoes and Lenin, but that's what we have.
Yeah, I think that's obviously a lie. It's one of the lies that the Russian president likes to advertise, but it's of course a lie. It's almost difficult to know what to do with statements like this, because where do you even start to debunk something which is so completely unfounded in reality? It's easier to answer the question, is neo-Nazism a problem in Ukraine? Because you can start to sort of approach that question in a rational way. But you know, if the question is, did Vladimir Lenin invent Ukraine? Where do you even start? No, he didn't. And there's a wealth of historical evidence.
Let's try to look at this rationally.
Yes.
Still, we have to fight with this Russian propaganda. When can we trace the first signs, for example, of Ukraine-Sweden historical relations?
I think the first, the very first beginning of relations between the peoples who lived in what is now Sweden and the people who lived in what is now Ukraine was, I think, sometime in the 10th, 11th centuries, when Swedish Vikings, who were both traders and warriors, used the Dnipro River as a conduit for their merchant traveling. If we go a little bit further down history to the 11th, I think late 11th, early 12th century, if I'm not mistaken, there was a marriage between Yaroslav the Wise, who was the son of Volodymyr the Great. He married Princess Ingegerd, who was a Swedish princess. She was the daughter of Olof Skötkonung, was his name. So Princess Ingegerd was the Swedish princess who married a Ukrainian prince, and they then became the ruling couple in Kiev Rus.
And let's remind ourselves that it was 2 centuries before the Moscow was founded.
Yes, I know. Yes, it was 2 centuries before Moscow was founded.
Why is Vladimir Putin finding it so difficult to recognize Ukrainian statehood?
I don't know. He seems to have an obsession with recolonizing Ukraine. He seems to have an obsession with reconquering a territory which used to be part of the Soviet Union, and which he, of some reason, appears to be very, very obsessed with. But why? I think you'll have to ask him.
We can move to another myth. This is about this myth says that a prerequisite to peace in Europe and Ukraine is Ukraine's neutrality. We can look at the example of Sweden here. Sweden has been neutral for over 200 years. And after the start of the full-scale invasion of Russia, Sweden has changed its policy and it's now no more neutral because it started its journey to join the NATO. So my question to you is, what is wrong with the policy of neutrality, and what do you think about this myth that Ukraine should become neutral in this situation?
Well, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of Ukraine, so I can just share my own maybe observations or reflections on this issue. First of all, when it comes to Sweden, Sweden has not been neutral for many decades, and it's simply inconceivable that an EU member state would be neutral in the face of aggression against another EU member state. So I think it's important to distinguish between being neutral and not being part of a military alliance. Sweden, so far, has not been part of a military alliance, because we haven't been part of NATO, and we're still not part of NATO. Our membership application still has to be ratified in all NATO countries. But even so, that doesn't mean that we're not neutral. It only means that we're not part of a military alliance. Now, in the case of Ukraine, if you ask me, the concept of neutrality loses all relevance. Ukraine has to defend its security against an aggressive neighbor. That aggressive neighbor is Russia. Russia's determination to destroy and subjugate Ukraine has been manifest from the very day of Ukrainian independence in 1991. The Russian Federation, since the very beginning of the existence of Ukraine as an independent European state, has been trying to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity in every way possible, by economic coercion and blackmail, by trying to stimulate corruption in Ukraine, by using its agents of influence to undermine state institutions in Ukraine, by energy blackmail, by using its control over gas resources to weaken Ukraine, and ultimately now, since 2014, by aggressive military means. So I don't fully understand how it's possible for Ukraine to be neutral vis-à-vis a country whose state policy is to weaken, subjugate, and ultimately destroy the Ukrainian state. I don't understand how neutrality can even be a relevant thing to talk about in that context. But that's just the way I would see it. Ukraine would like to seek its security in NATO. That is very difficult. It hasn't been possible so far. I can't comment on that process because Sweden isn't a member of NATO, but that would be one hypothetical option. Another option which is currently being discussed is the so-called, Kiev Security Compact, which is the idea that different countries declare how they would support Ukraine in security terms over time by different means, and different countries would then do different things, and the toolbox would include everything from military support to the promise to introduce sanctions in the event of Russian aggression, etc., etc. So that could be another model.
Russia has started the war, including under the pretext of preventing the NATO's expansion to the east. What it has got instead is an expansion of NATO in the north. Does it mean that the Russia's political goals of this invasion has failed, or were there goals?
Well, the first thing I would say is I think NATO has absolutely nothing to do with the current war, except in one fundamental respect. It's absolutely clear that Russia has been opposed to NATO, and that Russia has been angry when countries which used to be part of the Warsaw Pact have sought and ultimately achieved membership in NATO. That is something which Russia has opposed from day one. Now, Russia never opposed that because the Russians seriously believed that NATO was a threat to Russia or Russian interests. Russia only opposed NATO because it was an impediment against Russia's ambitions to subjugate and destroy the independence of its neighbors.
So Sweden is planning to join NATO, and what about the NAFO, North Atlantic Fellows Organization?
I've seen that on Twitter. I'm not sure that countries can apply for membership in NATO. I think that's something that people do. They have funny pictures of dogs.
Yeah, of Shiba Inu dogs. And you've seen the one in the avatar of Minister of Defense, Reznikov.
Yes, of course I saw it. Yes, I'm a follower of Mr. Reznikov on Twitter. So I've I remember very well when he had his avatar out there.
Do you have a favorite meme about Russian invasion in Ukraine? Because you know Ukrainians, they're brilliant.
There's so many. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, there's so many. One that I don't know what the technical definition of a meme is, but sort of if you mean sort of funny things on Twitter, then there's very many things. There was one incredible satire where some Ukrainian very funny people had done a sort of a spoof of the Russian permanent representative to the United Nations, where he was sort of doing a speech and talking about all the threats that Ukraine was posing to Russia. I think one of them was explosive snails, and he said how these. I think this was all on the back of the thing about the what was it, those mosquitoes armies or whatever it was that were supposed to invade Russia. And then he was saying, yeah, now there's these explosive snails and they're all moving in the direction of the Russian border, and we estimate that in 2025, August, they will reach the Russian border and explode themselves. I think that was a very funny one. Yeah.
Without humor, I don't know how we will cope with
Without
everything.
humor, I don't know how Ukraine would cope, because it's amazing the amount of creativity and the amount of humor that this war has generated in Ukraine.
That's how we keep our sanity, actually. Russia says it hasn't even started fighting yet. Mm-hmm. And this narrative got into the Swedish media with the words of Russian ambassador to Sweden. Yeah, you remember him, Tatarintsev, the one who said that they don't give nothing about the Western sanctions. But
I think he said that Russia would shit on Western
yes,
sanctions.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah,
was that
we have to say that.
or how would that happen? And or maybe it was
no
metaphorically.
Evidence, so
no evidence yet that he's actually done it. Thank God. Yeah.
Who knows?
Who knows? He might one day. Yeah, we never know.
You've seen what they left in the houses in Irpin, Polina saw.
I will show you the pictures afterwards. It's disgusting.
Yeah, I prefer not to see them. Yeah.
So, Tatarintsev.
Yes.
In this same interview, he said that if Russia switches from a special military operation to a war, the end of Ukraine will come very quickly. Very quickly. Mm. You're in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. You're witnessing the Ukrainian resistance to the aggressor and its fight for its independence, as well as you're witnessing the crimes and destruction that Russia brought to our land. November 15th. Mm-hmm. Russia hit Ukrainian territory with over 90 missiles. Yes. Is this a war, not a full capacity on Russia's part?
I'm not a military expert, so
how do you feel about that? Living in Kyiv.
But who knows? Mr. Tatarintsev is an employee of the Russian state service, and I'm sure that he is extremely competent and knows exactly what he's talking about. So I would never venture to second guess him. But I have to say, my impression is that the Russians are actually trying pretty hard in Ukraine. I don't get the impression that this is something they're doing with their left hand, and all of a sudden they have the capacity to dramatically change their fortunes on the battlefield. If indeed they did have that capacity, I would be surprised why they didn't employ it in order to keep the city of Kherson, from which they retreated, as you know, last week. So, I mean, again, I'm not a military expert, but certainly my impression is that the Russians are actually employing pretty much of their military capacity, and as far as I can judge from what's happening on the battlefield, they're not doing it particularly successful, even if, of course, through their campaign to terrorize Ukrainian civilians, they're still causing horrible damage and I could only imagine the pain and the suffering of all Ukrainians who have lost family members, both among the armed forces and among civilians. But nevertheless, in terms of in terms of Russia's war aims, my impression is that they're not succeeding.
Another dangerous narrative is in the info space is that Ukraine is like Afghanistan now. You have been ambassador to Afghanistan till 2019, and since 2019 you've been ambassador to Ukraine. So you obviously have something to say to compare these two very different countries from what I see, and what probably makes you prevent from saying that Ukraine follows the Afghan scenario, or vice versa.
I don't even know what that comparison means. In what way is Ukraine like Afghanistan? I don't get it.
First of all, Russians say that when they want to appeal to a civil war, some kind of a civil war happening in Ukraine. And the second, they want to highlight the possibility of government and army collapse.
Oh, I see.
So
Okay.
all the allies have to evacuate out of here one day because we're gonna, I don't know, collapse the government and so on. So that's obviously the narrative for allied states. That's not for Ukraine.
What was the first comparison with Afghanistan, you said?
Civil war.
Oh, civil war. Right. Well, I mean, it's not a civil war. There's never been a civil war in independent Ukraine. Ukraine has been an independent state since 1991, and there's never, ever been anything even remotely approaching a civil war in Ukraine. What there has been in Ukraine since 2014 is a war of aggression by the Russian Federation. It began in 2014 when Russia occupied Ukrainian Crimea, and then it continued with the Russian invasion of Donbass. At that time, Russia tried to pretend as if it wasn't they who were committing the invasion and occupation of parts of Donbass. They invented two fictions, which they called LNR and DNR, which had no relation to reality. And then they put a few puppets in these fake states who pretended to be ministers and officials and what have you. But there was never any doubt that this was simply a manifestation of an ongoing Russian invasion and subsequent occupation of eastern Ukraine. And that invasion and occupation then accelerated dramatically on the 24th of February 2022 when Russia increased its invasion in Ukraine. And we've seen the consequences since then. So on the first comparison, no, these are two very different things. In Afghanistan, yes, there was internal conflict between fundamentally the Taliban and the legitimate government of Afghanistan. In Ukraine, no such internal conflict has existed during the entire course of Ukraine's independence. So that is wrong. And the other comparison?
The government collapse.
And the military collapse.
Well, I don't know. I mean, who knows what will happen in the future? Maybe the Ukrainian government will collapse. Maybe the Russian government will collapse. Maybe the Swedish government will collapse. Nobody can predict what will happen in 1 or 5 or 10 or 20 years. But I can say one thing. I've lived in this country for 3.5 years now. I don't see any sign whatsoever in any way that the institutions of Ukrainian statehood, be they political, economic, social, or military, are crumbling or even have any serious cracks. So again, I can't predict what will happen in the future, but I would be exceptionally surprised if the institutions of Ukrainian statehood would start to fail. But who knows?
As we come to an end of our conversation, and we are coming to an end of our conversation, I'd like to ask you a question that is going to become a traditional for our Ambassadorial Season 2.0. We desperately need a good portion of good news for Ukraine. What are the good Ukraine-related news from Sweden that you'd like to deliver?
Well, I think one piece of good news from Sweden came today, this morning, when the Swedish government announced an unprecedented package of both military and humanitarian support. It is a big effort which Sweden has made to put together this package. It includes many different military capabilities, and it includes a lot of financial support also to Ukraine in order, among other things, to repair energy infrastructure, the infrastructure that Russia is currently destroying, and to provide other forms of humanitarian assistance, which hopefully will support Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, through this forthcoming winter, which will be, I think, a very challenging time.
Thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you very much for the support of the Swedish people and of the Swedish government and of Sweden. Like we do feel this support, and I think that for me personally, the support of international, of our Western allies, is what keeps us moving forward and fighting back against the Russian aggression, because we really need it.
Thank you so much for having me on the show again. It's been a pleasure.
And the pleasure was ours, totally. So, dear friends, these were Tatiana Hajduk, Polina Ivanishyn, and Tobias Thyberg, Ambassador of Sweden to Ukraine. Thank you once again.
Thanks.
And for all of our viewers worldwide, stay safe, stay kind. Remember, it's Kyiv, not Kiev. Remember to be brave like Ukraine, and see you very soon.